June 24th, 1967. 6 experienced cavers descend into England's most notorious cave system for what should be a routine mapping expedition. The Mossdale caverns are known as the Mount Everest of caving, a claustrophobic nightmare that has been seen by fewer humans than have stood on the moon. But in the next few hours, heavy rain will turn these limestone tunnels into a death trap, and 6 men will drown in passages so narrow they couldn't even turn around. You're watching Darkives, where we explore the places where human ambition meets nature's merciless power. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because today's investigation takes you into the darkest corners of the earth, where expertise means nothing when the cave decides to kill. This is the story of Britain's worst caving disaster, and the mountain that became a tomb. Deep in the Yorkshire Dales, where rolling green hills hide secrets carved in stone, there exists a place that has haunted the British caving community for over half a century. The Mossdale caverns lie beneath what appears to be just another picturesque moorland landscape. But beneath the surface lurks something far more sinister than tourists could ever imagine. The entrance is deceptively innocent, a small stream called Mossdale Beck that disappears into a limestone cliff face known as Mossdale Scar. But that vanishing water has spent thousands of years carving a labyrinth of death beneath the earth, creating over 5 miles of tunnels that plunge 700 feet into the darkness. This isn't a tourist cave with convenient walkways and electric lighting. This is a predator made of stone. The Mossdale caverns were discovered in 1941 by Bob Leakey, a legendary figure in British caving who was renowned for his inhuman endurance and his disturbing habit of diving into flooded cave passages while holding his breath, sometimes completely naked. Even Bob, who seemed incapable of feeling fear, quickly realized that Mossdale was different. After nearly drowning when the cave flooded around him during his early explorations, Bob's assistant refused to ever enter the caverns again, but Bob couldn't let it go. For over a year, he painstakingly mapped what would become known as the most dangerous cave system in Britain. The passages were rated super severe, a designation that made even the most experienced cavers shudder with horror. Large sections were submerged neck deep in icy water, with ominous names like Drown or Glory, where cavers sometimes had to hold their breath and dive completely underwater to progress forward. But the true nightmare of Mossdale was a section known simply as the Marathon, 1,800 feet of passage that could only be navigated by crawling on your belly through tunnels just 18 inches wide and 12 inches high. To put that in perspective, imagine crawling through a space barely larger than your computer screen for the length of 6 football fields, with no possibility of turning around once you committed to the journey. The marathon was divided into 2 sections, near marathon and far marathon, separated by a tiny 5-foot chamber that was the only place where a person could fully stand upright. The psychological horror of the marathon wasn't just its physical demands, but the knowledge that once you entered those crushing passages, you were effectively descending into an inescapable drain. When it rained on the Yorkshire moors, all that water funneled directly into the Mossdale system, and the single entrance would become completely submerged, trapping anyone inside. By the 1960s, modern equipment like neoprene wetsuits had made longer cave expeditions more feasible, and the newly formed University of Leeds Speleological Association wanted to make their mark by completing the survey of Mossdale caverns that Bob Leakey had started decades earlier. The cave continued much deeper than anyone had yet explored, blocked only by tight passages that could potentially be opened with controlled explosives. On the morning of June 24th, 1967, 26-year-old Dave Adamson prepared to lead an expedition that would cement his reputation as one of Britain's premier cave explorers. Dave was a founding member of the University of Leeds Speleological Association and had spent hundreds of hours mapping the deepest, most dangerous sections of Mossdale. His partner for this mission was 24-year-old Jeff Barrow, an experienced caver with expertise in using explosives to clear blocked passages. They weren't going alone. 4 more experienced cavers would assist with the technical work. 19-year-old William Frakes, 20-year-old John Ogden, 23-year-old Colin Vickers, and the youngest member of the team, 17-year-old Michael Ryan. The expedition would also include 4 amateur cavers on more of a sightseeing tour of the easier passages, including Dave's 22-year-old fiancée, Morag Forbes. Dave and Morag were planning to be married in just 6 weeks. She was excited about the upcoming wedding and thrilled to share in Dave's passion for exploring the underground world. This was supposed to be an adventure they could enjoy together before settling into married life. At 2 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, the party of 10 entered the Mossdale caverns. The water level was well below normal, and the moors appeared dry. Perfect conditions for an extended exploration. There had been a weather forecast predicting scattered thunderstorms later in the day, but Dave reassured anyone who expressed concern. He knew this cave system better than anyone alive, and he was confident in his ability to judge when conditions were becoming dangerous. The group immediately split up, with the surveying team moving at a much faster pace while wearing protective gear and wetsuits. The casual explorers took their time to enjoy the otherworldly experience of the underground chambers, dropping through the larger boulder hall and assembly hall before reaching Rough Chamber, where the real difficulties began. By 3:30 p.m., the surveying team had already begun their progress into Near Marathon, where further advancement became significantly more challenging. The 4 less experienced cavers, especially considering that the 2 women had no wetsuits, made the sensible decision to turn back. They safely arrived back on the surface at 5 p.m., where the sky was overcast and beginning to drizzle slightly. Morag was a little worried about the deteriorating weather, but the conditions didn't appear to give any major cause for concern. The group returned to their base at the nearby shooting hut, where they ate and changed clothes. Some of the party left for the night, but Morag decided to remain until Dave and the remaining cavers returned. Meanwhile, far below the surface, Dave and his 5 companions had made the arduous 3-hour journey through both the near and far marathon crawls. The physical and psychological demands of crawling through those crushing passages had left them exhausted, but they had successfully reached the stream-end caverns where they could finally stand upright and rest. Dave and Jeff began placing their explosive charges at the tight passages that blocked further exploration. Their plan was to detonate these charges, then leave and begin the long journey back to the surface. They would return on a later expedition to explore whatever new areas the explosions had opened up. It was methodical, professional work, exactly the kind of careful approach that had made Dave's reputation in the caving community. But while they worked in the depths, the weather on the surface was deteriorating rapidly. By 7:30 p.m., heavy rain was falling across the Yorkshire Dales, and Morag was becoming increasingly concerned for the safety of the men still underground. She made another trip to Mossdale Scar at about 7:30, finding little immediate change in the water conditions, but the rain was becoming heavier with each passing hour. At roughly 9 p.m., Morag returned to the cave entrance for what she thought would be a final check before the men emerged. What she saw when she arrived would haunt her for the rest of her life. Where there had been a small stream and the familiar cave entrance, there was now a vast lake of churning brown water. The entire base of the limestone scar was submerged, and the entrance to the cave was completely invisible beneath the flood. Morag knew immediately that Dave and his team were in mortal danger. She ran almost a mile across the moors to the nearby farmhouse, found it deserted, then ran another 1.5 miles through the darkness to reach help. A local resident drove her to a telephone, and the call for emergency assistance was received at 11:10 p.m. Deep underground, the 6 men had finished setting their charges and begun their journey back toward the surface. Jeff Barrow and 17-year-old Michael Ryan were leading the return trip, entering the far marathon passage at approximately 8 p.m. They had been crawling for about 20 minutes when something horrifying began to happen. The men would have heard it first, an almost jet engine-like sound echoing through the tunnels toward them. As the massive volume of rainwater flooded the cave entrance, the regular drainage routes became completely overwhelmed. Water that normally flowed through designated channels was now backing up and diverting into every available space, including the marathon passages. Moments before the wave hit them, Jeff and Michael would have realized what was happening. But in those narrow tunnels, barely large enough for a human body, there was nowhere to go. The water struck them like a liquid freight train, and within minutes the small tunnel filled completely from floor to ceiling. The two young men fought desperately to find any pocket of air, pressing their faces into the smallest cracks in the limestone ceiling, but there was simply too much water, and it was rising too fast. As they struggled to breathe in the rapidly shrinking airspaces, Dave Adamson was leading the other four men into the same death trap behind them. Colin Vickers, John Ogden, and Bill Frakes followed Dave into Far Marathon, unaware that their friends ahead were already drowning. As the water reached them, they faced the same impossible situation, trapped in a passage too narrow to turn around, with a wall of water bearing down on them and nowhere to escape. John Ogden, being the last in the tunnel, had slightly more warning than the others. He could hear the desperate cries of his friends ahead of him as the water rose, and he made a frantic attempt to back out of the passage. But there wasn't enough time. The flood was moving too fast, and the tunnel was too long. In their final moments, the 6 men did the only thing they could do. They tried to wedge themselves into any crack or crevice in the cave ceiling that might provide a few extra inches of breathing space. John Ogden managed to jam his body vertically into an impossibly tight fissure in the rock, a space so narrow that it seemed impossible for a human to fit inside. But in the desperate fight for survival, panic gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. It wasn't enough. One by one, the 6 experienced cavers drowned in passages so narrow they couldn't even spread their arms. The cave that had challenged and fascinated them had become their tomb, filling every available airspace with the same water that had carved it over millennia. On the surface, a massive rescue operation was mobilizing. The Upper Wharfdale Fell rescue team arrived first, followed by fire departments with pumps and heavy equipment. But the scale of the flooding was beyond anything they had prepared for. The cave entrance was under 4 feet of water, and every attempt to pump it out was futile against the continuing rainfall. Desperate to save the trapped men, rescue coordinators called in a JCB digger to divert the entire Mossdale Beck using an 8-foot deep, 130-yard trench. Nearly 300 cavers, rescuers, and support staff worked through the night in a Herculean effort to build reinforced dams and redirect the water flow. It was a race against time that everyone knew they were probably losing. It wasn't until 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, 18 hours after the men had become trapped, that water levels finally dropped enough to allow rescuers to enter the cave system. 2 teams of 6 experienced cavers descended into the flooded passages, supported by telephone lines that had been run as deep as Rough Chamber. The first scenario everyone hoped for was that the men had taken refuge in Rough Chamber, roughly midway through the cave system. But when rescuers reached that area, they found no sign of the missing cavers. There was still hope that they had made it to the higher levels of the mud caverns, but those more experienced with Mossdale were becoming very concerned. As the rescue teams progressed deeper into the cave, they found disturbing evidence of the massive flood that had occurred. Foam and debris coated every surface, proving that the passages had been flooded to the ceiling. No air spaces had been left anywhere in the system. They also found equipment from the expedition, including a large battery that had been swept along by the rushing water and caught on an outcropping, demonstrating the tremendous force of the flood. At 5:30 p.m. on Sunday evening, after hours of painstaking progress through the flooded cave system, one of the rescue teams turned a corner in Far Marathon and saw something that confirmed their worst fears. 4 legs were visible in the narrow passage ahead. After a preliminary search, they found 5 bodies wedged into cracks and crevices in the cave ceiling, where the men had made their final desperate attempts to find air. The message was relayed back to the surface. Turn back. They're all dead. Many of the rescue team were openly weeping as they sat in the narrow passage, debating whether it would be possible to remove the bodies from such a confined space. But before they could make any decisions, word came from the surface that another thunderstorm was forming and the dam was beginning to break down. the rescuers had to evacuate immediately or risk becoming victims themselves. It was only after returning to the surface that the rescue teams realized they had made a mistake in their count. They were still missing John Ogden, the sixth member of the expedition. But with the weather deteriorating and the dam failing, there was no possibility of continuing the search that night. For 2 more days, rescue efforts continued as volunteers worked around the clock to maintain the failing dam structure. It wasn't until Wednesday morning that searchers finally located John Ogden's body, jammed vertically into an extremely tight fissure just 15 feet from where the other 3 men had been found. He was wedged so high up in the ceiling crack and so covered with silt that only his boots and a bit of his white helmet were visible. The coroner arrived on Wednesday evening and, despite strong convictions among the rescuers to move the bodies to a more accessible area of the cave where they could be properly buried, prohibited any further entry into the caverns. The Mossdale caverns were officially sealed, becoming the final tomb for Dave Adamson, Jeff Barrow, Colin Vickers, John Ogden, Bill Frakes, and 17-year-old Michael Ryan. The official cause of death was ruled as drowning as a result of misadventure. But the investigation revealed the true scope of the tragedy. This had been a preventable disaster. Weather warnings had predicted the thunderstorms that caused the fatal flooding, but they had been ignored or underestimated. The cave's reputation for dangerous flooding was well known, but the lure of exploration had overcome caution. In 1971, friends of the deceased cavers returned to Mossdale on a painful mission. They successfully moved the 6 bodies to a higher area of the cave system called the Sanctuary, where they would be safe from all but the most severe flooding. A small memorial cairn was placed on the moor above, marking the exact spot underground where the men now rest. The cave is no longer physically sealed, and while no one officially prevents access, very few people dare to enter. The exceptions are 2 modern explorers, Simon Beck, who has made over 100 trips into Mossdale, many of them completely alone, and Alex Ritchie, who has descended 8 times. Both men have documented the cave extensively, providing the only modern footage of the passages where 6 men died. When asked why he returns to a place with such a horrific history, Alex described caving as the last true exploration on Earth, a chance to see something that perhaps no human has ever seen before. Simon Beck has written extensively about the psychological draw of Mossdale, describing it as a place where there is no light at the end of this tunnel, only darkness. The only light is what you bring, and the deeper you go, the darker it gets. Both modern explorers report eerie experiences in the cave. Water bouncing around the limestone passages creates sounds that are disturbingly similar to human voices echoing in the distance. Whether these are just acoustic tricks or something more supernatural, they serve as constant reminders that Mossdale remains a tomb as well as a cave. The question that haunts the caving community is whether there are still unexplored sections of Mossdale waiting to be discovered. It was the pursuit of those unknown passages that brought Dave Adamson and his team to their deaths, and it continues to draw the handful of explorers brave enough to enter the system today. What makes the Mossdale tragedy so disturbing isn't just the way the men died, trapped in spaces too small to turn around, drowning in complete darkness while wedged into ceiling cracks barely large enough for a human body. It's the knowledge that this disaster was entirely preventable, caused by a combination of ignored weather warnings and the irresistible human compulsion to explore the unknown. The cave didn't care about Dave Adamson's expertise or his years of experience mapping its passages. It didn't care that Jeff Barrow was skilled with explosives, or that Michael Ryan was only 17 years old. When the Yorkshire moors dumped their rainfall into those limestone tunnels, Mossdale became an execution chamber where experience meant nothing and escape was impossible. Dave Adamson never made it to his wedding with Morag. Michael Ryan never saw his 18th birthday. 6 men who had conquered the most challenging underground passages in Britain died in a place that was supposed to be their domain, killed not by their mistakes, but by their refusal to respect the mountain's power. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Mossdale tragedy is that people still go back. Despite knowing the history, despite understanding the risks, explorers continue to be drawn into those deadly passages. The cave that claimed 6 lives continues to exert its dark fascination, because the human need to explore the unknown is stronger than the fear of becoming another casualty. The Mossdale caverns remain both a marvel of natural engineering and a monument to human hubris. They remind us that some places are indifferent to our presence, that expertise and experience can become meaningless when nature decides to assert its dominance. In those narrow limestone passages, 6 men learned the hardest lesson of all, that the earth doesn't care how brave you are. Have you ever pushed yourself into a dangerous situation for the thrill of exploration? What drives people to risk everything for the chance to see something no one else has seen? Let me know in the comments and tell me what other underground disasters you'd like me to investigate. If this story made you appreciate the safety of staying above ground, hit that like button and subscribe for more investigations into humanity's most dangerous obsessions. Until next time, remember that some places are meant to remain unexplored.